I'm actually being flanked by some of the most prominent companies, Mahindra on my left and SKF on my right. And we've also got panelists Jen, who's the head of industry at the Climate Group for both SteelZero and Concrete. She's joining us online. And we've also got Abdullah, the head of ESG at Lodha Group. Quick introductions. Ankit Todi is the DGM of Group Sustainability and Strategy and Partnerships at the Mahindra Group. Like we all know, Mahindra is a diversified business in several segments of the industry. But of course, automobile being the most significant one for us. SKF, Sreekanth Raja, is the head of Supplier, Quality Assurance and Supplier Development as SKF. For people who know, SKF is a prominent brand globally in ball bearings and seals. Jen Carson is, like I said, is the head of SteelZero and Concrete Zero for Climate Group globally. She is the brain behind and the engine behind, alongside with Samin, who's been pushing the campaign to newer heights. It's amazing to see in the last 2 years we've been able to have 36 companies globally which have taken these commitments, and it's all to credit goes to Jen as well as Samin for the amazing work. No introductions. Again, Lodha Group, a big construction company pioneering in construction. More so, it's leading in sustainability, both with focus on not just reducing embodied emissions, but also operational emissions as well. Welcome on for the panel. It's great to see that we've got a mixed set of companies on the panel today, both from construction. We've also got an auto company manufacturer with us as well, and then we've got from the construction space. Like Abbas mentioned, it makes a lot of sense for us to have folks from the construction and the auto space together, because both of them put together pretty much contribute to around 60% of the annual steel demand here in India, which is huge, isn't it? With that, we'll probably move to the first question, and maybe I can invite Jen again. We've been with the theme of SteelZero since morning, so maybe it's just logical for us to begin with you, Jen. Jen, what's happening? Why are companies joining SteelZero campaign? You've been associated with the campaign for a while now. What's making 36 companies globally take this commitment? Of course, this is tremendous work. And what we love to hear from you is also what kind of companies are joining the campaign. Do you see something that really stands out for you when you look at the progress in the last 3 years? Over to you, Jen.
Thank you very much, Abbas. And just to double check that you can hear me correct, all right?
Yes, can hear you well.
Perfect, thank you. So yeah, thank you very much for having me into the forum. I think actually really interestingly, and building on a question we just had from the floor in terms of what are the definitions and what are the ways that the demand side are articulating their expectations and wanting to engage with steel decarbonisation conversation. And we just heard the FNC, the description that runs between 0.4 and 0.1 tons of carbon per ton of steel. We were very much involved in the design committee for that definition, and then have built through into the SteelZero commitment how that looks to 2030 and 2050 to really scale the conversation. So we're working with the leading companies who are already very serious about taking on this difficult challenge, and how to best work with the supply chain up and downstream. I would say another piece that stands out to me on why companies are joining is that there's lots of tremendous work happening within sustainability, procurement, strategy departments. And those colleagues are then looking more broadly at their own companies, but also their peers, to understand and link with their suppliers, their partners, and also policy decision makers. So they're really wanting to understand on this complex challenge. I'm sure it's already been discussed today. It's very essential that we have that collaboration across the whole supply chain and value chain. Yes, in construction, but also looking to automotive or shipping and other sectors on lessons learned and how to consistently, collectively look at this learning. One of the quotes that comes to mind is CEO of Volvo Cars, who is a member of SteelZero, and he says that no one company can do this in isolation, so that's why they're partnering with other companies to eliminate fossil fuels from steel and battery production. I think maybe if I could also just add another point, and I'm sure Samin will have covered this in the presentation, one of the powerful lessons that we had from the Europe work was that we're working with architects, designers, engineers, but also contractors, developers, fabricators. So again, talking to that consistency of conversation, looking to those definitions, how can we have these common terms of reference that the whole sector and ecosystem can really talk to. Maybe I'm just remembering another quote that came to me from the World Steel Association, noting that in the last 24 months, really the tone of the conversation has U-turned, and we're now really looking at net zero, deep decarbonisation that needs to happen across that really tricky technical conversation that was also flagged in the discussion we just had.
Thanks, Shen. I'll move to Ankit next. Ankit, with the kind of, the diversification of businesses you have, clearly, I mean, we all will realize Mahindra probably is one of the biggest consumers of steel when it comes to, companies in India. I remember having this conversation with you and one of your colleagues in Mumbai at one of your offices last year, when the sense that we received was, this is not as simple as you think, right? There's probably more than 20 kinds of steel that you procure. And if I have the precise number, 27 you mentioned, around that, different kinds of steel that you probably procure and source for supporting your businesses. So clearly it's not a run of the mill, right? You just can't go in the markets, pick up a certain kind of steel and say, well, this is low emission steel. So what would this transition for a company like yours mean, a low emission steel transition? And because you've been thinking about this so closely at the moment, can you also tell us what are the kind of challenges are you facing, not just in terms of conversation, but also dealing with your value chain?
Thank you, Atul. So let me start off by talking a little bit about why is this issue important. So as Mahindra Group, we actually have a net zero commitment around 2040, and we in fact raised the bar internally and want to be a planet positive company. Now, one key lever for this is what do we do in terms of decarbonizing the industries that we are present in. Auto obviously is a big part of the portfolio. Now, in the auto sector, when we talk about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, the nature of the auto industry is such that a large part of disproportionately high emissions is from the scope 3 emissions. So scope 3 is because you sell cars, cars use fuel, so it's all scope 3 emissions. The biggest lever to transition there is to shift to EVs. That's a slow process. It will be driven by a lot of external factors. After the downstream emission from, let's say, fuel burning, steel is the next biggest emission lever. And to give you very specific numbers, about 10% of the product purchase is the scope 3 emission. And within that, steel is about 50% of that. A typical car would have about 800 to 1,000 kgs, depending on what kind of car. So that's where this is a very important conversation. We can transition to EV, but how do we still get to scope 3 net zero? A big lever would be if the steel industry gets to net zero. So that's the first point. The second part of the question that you asked, Atul, was around what are the challenges that we are facing? So as I just was talking about earlier, when we talk about the definition of net zero steel, that itself is a big question mark. There are very stringent definitions that people are discussing at the global stage. And we very realistically, pragmatically realize that it's not available. That steel itself, and one of the exercises that we did about a year back was actually reach out to all the steel mill producers. We buy from about 12 different companies, I believe. We reached out to each of them to try and understand from them that what is their net zero steel or green steel or low emission steel plans. None of them had a clear answer. But the very fact that we reached out and triggered a conversation itself led to a lot of discussion around this topic. And we very clearly realized that this is not something that will very easily happen by 2030, which is, let's say, a near-term goal. I wouldn't even talk about 2050, 2070, it's too far. In 2030, what can be realistically possible? So in that effort, the 2-3 biggest challenges that we realized, obviously the steel industry will have to do their job, the government will have to do their job, and there's a lot of policy recommendations around that. But the realistically small pragmatic steps need to be taken. And for it to be pragmatic, 2-3 things as a buyer we'll need to solve for. One, as Atul rightly pointed out, it's not a simple conversation. Steel is not just one element. There are lots of variety, lots of other factors apart from the emission that will go into it the moment you change the process, etc. So it has to meet all the stringent safety requirements, and then you'll have to buy the relevant low emission steel. The second part is obviously cost is also going to be constrained. You cannot have green steel which is at 100% premium over what is existing available. So it has to be some bit of a premium, maybe, but it has to be realistic. It needs to make commercial sense. So I think these are sort of the two issues: the availability, the cost at which it's available, and what's a pragmatic approach and timeline in which we can get there. Let me pause with that.
Great, thanks, Ankit, for that. I'll probably go to Sreekanth next. Sreekanth, for SKF as a company which is in ball bearings and seals, again, you are a significant user of steel and different kinds of steel as well. The upstream side of emissions for SKF certainly is going to be a big share of your emissions as well. You were the 11th company to take the SteelZero commitment alongside with the responsible steel standard as well, a couple of years back, in fact, to be precise, in 2021. What made SKF think so ambitiously about taking the SteelZero commitment? We've heard a view from Mahindra. We've heard a view from Ankit to say, well, they've reached out to a few steel mill producers, not very optimistic in the sense of how much they can supply, but it has triggered a conversation. I'm sure you've done a bit of that as well. What's your feeling? What made you confident to and gave you the faith and trust to kind of take this commitment?
So, first of all, I echo with what Ankit has done. We've done the same thing as what talking to steel suppliers and trying to get a fair idea of what exactly is the roadmaps, and of course, it's still on the discussion mode. But what prompted us to take it forward was the customer requirements. As I see that, today we have most of the automotive customers talking about their ambitions to go for a net zero by 2030 or 2040, for example. And so everyone is coming forward with a requirement that the products that I receive as a customer would be free, would be fossil free with electricity or something like that. So therefore, we were trying to more or less comply with those needs, and their KPIs are connected to the technical specifications that they are making. So this means that we also have to comply predominantly to those KPI requirements. And that's the reason why we are ambitious enough. Secondly, SKF from the beginning has been very strong in trying to, has the quest of meeting the sustainability targets, and thereby we have done a decent work in scope 1, scope 2 already. But steel, if you look at our overall purchasing power, probably in the direct material, steel accounts for 90-95% of our entire category. So, but then overall at a high level, we are not the biggest consumer for steel, and therefore we have this reason to join SteelZero, for example, to be able to voice out opinions along with all of the members, and be able to take support on improving the suppliers, infrastructure, etc. So that's the reason why we are doing it. At a global level, of course, we are trying to do a lot of work in terms of technology innovations, etc., coupling up with some steel mills. But here it's still on a discussion model, I would say. This might.
Thanks, Sreekanth. So I take two things from the conversation so far. Of course, huge ambition from Jen and the excitement that she sees about how companies are responding to commitments. I think we all will believe, and I think there's no doubt about it, that it needs to begin with a commitment, right? So, and we are seeing a lot of businesses globally, and not just globally, but also in India, kind of starting with that theory of change. I've heard a bit about what Ankit said about pragmatism, which needs to be applied as well. And Sreekanth, from you about customers demanding something and businesses responding to it, right? I see you as the voice of the construction space on this panel today. I think pretty much the same question that I had for Ankit about what will this low emission steel transition mean for the construction sector in the first place? What have you been thinking about it, and what kind of challenges do you foresee in this transition to low emission steel?
Yeah, hi, Atul. I think you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you well. Thanks.
Yeah. So the fact that we all are here discussing this, makes that we all agree that decarbonization of economy is existential issue for all of us. If you look at the overall GHG emissions, various studies say that more than
I guess there's a network issue. Um, let's give it the next 5 seconds, or maybe we can.
There was also an issue from my
Yeah.
side.
No, I think
so
on
if
this.
you,
Sorry, on we lost you
you
for
can
like
hear
the
me
last
now?
10 seconds. Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. So I was saying that if you look at the overall GHG emissions, various estimates suggest that more than 1/3 of them come from construction and operation of built environment, real estate. Within that, a significant amount of emissions, maybe say 1/3, are embodied emissions. And if you look at steel, steel is a very major component in the embodied emissions. And it's actually unlike what the friends from Mahindra and SKF were telling. In construction, the emission percentage of steel is quite varied. So it can be as low as 5 to 10% if you're using recycled steel. And it can go as high as 25 to 30% if you're using primary steel. And then if the structure is itself a steel structure, then it can go more than 50%. So it depends on what type of building is being constructed. So if any effort is to be done to decarbonize the built environment, I think finding solutions for low carbon, zero carbon steel is essential. Uh, Now coming to your point as to how we are looking at it is that our current focus is to keep our steel related embodied carbon emissions in the range of say 5 to 8% by using where possible high quality recycled steel. Uh, Anything beyond that in terms of so I mean so zero carbon net zero steel, it doesn't exist. We feel that it's still like 10 years away when it will be viable for us. So our current focus remains on utilizing optimal quantity of steel by undertaking all the design measures that we can, and then going as far as possible for high quality recycled steel.
Sure. Thanks, Son. Jen, I'll move back to you with the question of growth of campaigns such as SteelZero and the First Movers Coalition. And I like to take this analogy, in fact, for people who are familiar with the RE100 campaign, when it kicked off way back in 2014, it took off extremely slow. But as soon as, there were renewable energy instruments for corporates available in the market. While these instruments matured, there was an exponential growth in the way in which companies started looking at the campaign and also taking commitments. And that exponential growth, in fact, saw more than 400 companies now on the RE100 platform just in a matter of the last 6 to 7 years. But the moot question here, Jen, which is I'm sure you're struggling with as well, is that there's no commercially available net zero steel, or for that matter, low emission steel available in the market. How will campaigns such as the First Movers Coalition, the campaigns such as SteelZero will kind of get traction? And what is it that campaigns such as these should do in terms of engaging with steel producers and engagement on the supply side?
Yes, thank you, Atul. And I think already some of these themes are coming through in what we're hearing from the different panelists here. We cannot just click our fingers and have green steel tomorrow. We all know that. We're not naive. None of us here are that naive, and that's exactly why we're having these different conversations. And so what we are always looking at in this work is the ambition and, yes, the vision that we need to drive and the milestones to get there. 2030, for example, 2040 has already come up several times, and it's excellent companies here are already working to that date. But what are the pragmatic steps that we can take immediately to then get us on that right pathway so that we can see the type of exponential growth that we have seen in RE100? But factually and fundamentally, the steel sector is different. We also then need to be looking at the energy infrastructure. So the electricity that's going in the arc furnaces, the hydrogen that needs to be transitioning into blast furnaces. Again, these are incredibly long timeframes that we need to be looking at and then accelerating and understanding what are the pragmatic steps today, tomorrow, 25, that we need to work towards. And we've already heard from the colleagues on the panel, you mentioned and asked how are companies in this forum reaching out to the supply side. And so having those conversations, starting that dialogue, but then looking at tangible ways. Could they partner on this? Could there be a specific project that looks at the materials going into a specific component within a car or a wind turbine or a building? So it's breaking down this quite frankly, huge challenge into the parts that each of the individual organizations and then with their relationships can play to start that ball rolling.
Thanks, Jen. Just picking up on that and maybe going to Ankit for the next question. And again, just Ankit, probably nudging you to be a bit more specific. One, of course, we all know that Mahindra is also signed up to the First Movers Coalition. So a bit of why that, in the first place, what kind of got you thinking about it? And also, like I said, the most specific part of it is, what kind of tangible actions have you taken so far in terms of looking at this transition or charting out this transition on low carbon steel?
Thank you, Atul. So let me maybe for everyone's benefit talk a little bit about what First Movers Coalition is, and then I'll answer the other part of the question. So First Movers Coalition, very similar to Green Steel, SteelZero, is a platform of companies from the demand side talking about the hard to abate sector, steel being one of them. There are 6 or 7 other sectors, sustainable aviation and construction and the likes of that. And the idea is very simple, that create advocacy for the manufacturers to transition to the green steel, green construction, green concrete, and so on. That's the idea. We as Mahindra were one of the founding members at the global stage, and the reason we were part of this is very similar. As I said, steel is one of the major, not just steel, but I think across the group, all the other elements are also important to us, so concrete and steel. But at the same time, as I said, it's a very important component of our scope 3 emissions. So for us to be able to meet our net zero targets, it's important for the industry to move ahead. The second part, and I'll sort of bring Mr. Mahindra in. He's been at the global stage already an advocate for sustainability. So I remember about 4-5 years back, he was representing the civil society. Actually, the civil society was represented by Leonardo DiCaprio, and Mr. Mahindra was representing the private sector at the global stage to call upon all companies to commit to SBT targets at United Nations. So I think as a company, we are committed to sustainability, and not just for our operations, but to sort of drive the country forward in that direction. So with that broader intent, I think that's the reason we signed up for this. And more practically, it helps us meet our targets. That's the 2 parts.
Sreekanth, I can't hold myself but say this. Ball bearings are used for reducing friction, right? Between moving parts, isn't it? How are you helping the sector to reduce friction from a value chain engagement point of view? I'm sure this is complex, right? For Escape to kind of go out there and say we want to demand a certain kind of steel. Again, like Mahindra, I'm sure you're using different kinds of steel as well. Could be low carbon, could be mild steel, could be high carbon steel, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of engagement. how are you reducing that friction with the value chain? What is your engagement? What is your approach there?
Let me start this again. Let me give a background on what is our strategy, basically. The strategy is intelligent and clean growth. Intelligent talks about connecting technologies to meet customers, to provide customers the best products using technologies. And clean talks about sustainable future. In the sense, we are trying to work on sustainable solutions to support customers, not only customers, investors, employees, as well as the suppliers in all and all. So in this case, predominantly our idea is to work on circularity. We're working on a lot of products which are more so on a RDP basis. For example, Recon Oil that we are doing is more on a customer-specific RDP model. So similarly, we've got a lot of ideas around for the downstream. We also have good amount of focus on upstream, where we are trying to work closely with steel makers, but this is not prominent in India. But we are doing it quite a lot in Europe in trying to work along projects where green steel is being looked at, or we are trying to work on scrap-based steels and all that. So that's something which we are doing. But what we are differently doing in India, for example, we are, although the targets that we have is driven by the group. We have a target of meeting the value chain by 2050 and operations by 2030. That's the ambition that we have. For that, what we are trying to do is to start building awareness amongst our Tier 1 suppliers and Tier 2 suppliers. So we had a recent session on sustainability explaining our requirements, but not only trying to explain, but also give a flair of what support do they require. And that's what that will be eventually the way forward. The first of it, I believe, is to harmonize the carbon emission calculations. We do not have a right methodology today. Everyone has. We tried to do it something last year, but I think we are somewhere not there in terms of how to harmonize this. Second, I believe, is digitalize the value chain, in the sense, if you're able to track from raw material to the end product with a barcode, and try to also put in some AI methodologies to trace out the CO emissions. That would be something which I would look forward. But right now, we are trying to more work closely on educating our supplier base, because although we say we are ambitious about 2050, we have interim targets for every stage. We have 2025 target to reduce something, we have 2030, 2040. So we have a systematic timelines to be able to build it. And that's how we wanted to proceed. We do this by mentoring. We just don't want to own it on the suppliers. We'll also be closely working. For example, we had partnered with EY to do ESG assessments at critical supplier base that we have. So we do this, but we will do the hand-holding from our side. So that's my take on it.
Thanks, Sreekanth. Next question to you on, with Lodha's commitment to net positive impact on the environment, what actions or steps are you planning in using low carbon steel solutions? What's the outlook on it?
Okay, so at Lodha, we are looking at the overall spectrum of carbon emissions in the built environment, and through Lodha Net Zero Urban Accelerator, which we have in partnership with RMI, we are actually trying to decarbonize each bit of that, from embodied carbon to the demand side, supply side, and even beyond the operational boundaries. To be very frank, I think the main driver of decarbonization in the short term is not steel. As I said, that we continue to focus on keeping the steel emissions sub 10% in the embodied carbon by trying to design efficiently, use less steel, and tilting to more towards high quality recycled steel. We wish to, keep the overall carbon emissions low. The main focus always, as of now, is concrete and the efficiency. Having said that, I would like to add one more layer here, is that I agree with Sreekanth that so we go to zero carbon steel as a next step, but even today, this supply chain is very data scarce. So what is the actual emission? That itself is very difficult to track, and We have been engaging with our supply chain as well, and we have been influencing them to get the EPDs done, get Green Pro certification done, and so on. Because the first thing is to just know where we currently are, and then obviously for us, this zero carbon steel is I think something that I mean the industry will have to evolve there, and we will just we'll follow and see. Uh, uh, and the other point is that I don't think we are a very big demand center as well. So if you look at Lodha's demand, it's like 50-70,000 tons a year. And and us being one of the largest real estate companies, if you club all the leading developers, uh, exclude infrastructure, I think it will still be sub-million tons. So it's a very small, demand center. So that's where we are.
Sure, small piece of the pie, Lodha, but still important. So I think one of the things that you touched on, which was really important for me, I think because the conversation on definition is something that's come up several times this morning. And you spoke about the need for having data from the supply chain, having mechanisms and frameworks for us to measure it, but also having a mechanism for companies to disclose it. I think all of that is going to be extremely important in terms of also leading all of these things into building the foundations for the performance of a definition or definitions for that matter, right? Eventually, when investors are going to look at definitions, you'll have to have these foundations in place because investors are probably will want to have some of these mechanisms in place for them to look at what kind of reward needs to be given to what kind of companies, so what kind of definitions they adopt. So I think these conversations are extremely useful. Jen, a final question to you. What is your ask from policymakers? In this case, what's your call to action?
Thanks, Atul. And if I may actually, just on that data point to add, because extremely well summarized, and you've also reminded me that one of the things, even more so that opens up, is potential interesting business model opportunities when it's coming to the end of life. And I think in construction space, that's particularly relevant when we're looking at deconstruction of different buildings or infrastructure assets. Once we have a accurate chain of custody and flow of information on the material characteristics of steel, for example, then there may also be different business models that opens up when looking to reuse that and bring that back into the circularity. So apologies, Abdullah, I hope you don't mind me adding that reflection. In terms of asks for policy, so excellent question and very varied and broad question as well. We have the paper that we wrote just this time last year that looked at 6 key principles from a global perspective. I think I would highlight in particular the power of public procurement. So here in this forum, we're looking at private sector procurement, and we've talked a lot about that, but we've also talked about that harmonization to really get the whole value chain moving together. And so I would say there's a really big opportunity for us to be looking at taking the pioneering work that's been done here on private sector and harmonizing that and building momentum for the public procurement.
Fair. Ankit, maybe if you could respond on the same thing in terms of, what do you think policymakers should be doing more?
Definitely, Atul. So I think the report itself covers a lot of the policy recommendations, but I'll sort of stress on three different points. So one, to Jen's point, a collation of the requirement, the demand side requirement is a step in that direction to ensure that people are talking about it. And I'll take a very specific example. Just as recently as earlier this week, SIAM is actually doing an exercise where they are collating the requirement of all the auto sector companies on green steel. So that is going to go as a recommendation to the Ministry of Steel. So that's a big step, hopefully will lead to tangible action. The second thing is also talking about the pragmatic approaches that can be done in the short term. One of that is suitable and applicable for India is how can we increase the scrap steel that's available in the country. Their policies around the second order industries. So what I mean by that is, let's say, end of life vehicle recycling is a big lever through which you can get scrap steel. The government is already working in that direction. There are policies at the central level in place on end of life vehicle recycling. It just needs to go a step further at the state level. That will enable the supply of scrap steel to the industry. The third thing is viability gap funding. At the end of the day, if we really talk about a 50%, green steel, low emission steel, it needs to be financially viable for the end user. And for that, you need viability gap funding. The steel industry needs that viability gap funding. So incentives in that direction, which enable them to transition to the right technology, let's say using green hydrogen, using whatever other electric arc furnace methods. Again, we have lots of experts from the steel industry, but there are methods available. It's a matter of viability gap funding. So those 3 points, if they get addressed, should hopefully accelerate the journey to this direction.
Thanks, Ankit. On and Sreekanth, would you want to respond to the questions on policy?
No, I think I agree with Ankit, but what's important is to create a market for this low carbon embedded steel, because today we are all talking about technology, but we don't have a demand as such. That has to be created commercially viable. A lot of people are doing a lot of things, but then what is missing today is a real market need, which is more commercially driven also. So that's something which we need to focus. Otherwise, I think I go with whatever Ankit has said. So.
On any final thoughts from your side?
So I agree. I think what incentives can come from the government for the producers as well as on the demand side, that will ultimately drive this. Also noting that the large infrastructure push that is there by the government, which will, I think, be the primary consumer of steel, the largest consumer of steel. I think there a lot of action can be taken, which will which can help drive this green steel demand. And also, very important point that Ankit was raising is that the scrap supply chain, which can lead to higher percentages of recycled steel production in India, which is very, very low as compared to, say, US, or Europe. I think a lot of work needs to be done at central level, but also at local levels where all of this collection and processing will have to be done.
Great. I think we pretty much come to the end of this conversation. We've got the next 10 minutes with us for questions for the panelists. But before I do that, I'll also leave a question from my end, which is probably the elephant in the room as well, and choose to answer it or not for the panelists. But what's the conversation within companies on the higher costs of green steel? Is there a bit of is there a position within companies at the moment on that? I'll leave it at that for now, but I'll see maybe once we've got a few questions as well, you can patch in your responses within that as well. But now the floor is open, so questions for the speakers. We've got a question from the right-hand side of.
I think you have left the elephant in a china shop where I think 7 blind men will see it differently and they will answer you differently. That is
So
one.
what's your view?
My view is definitely I will have to say that since they will be procuring green steel, there is a cost. And once they will be getting a cost, they will also have to pass it on to the customer. That is a simple economics, how it works. That's very clear. Second thing is that my question is to Mr. Abdullah. He was saying that he will use optimal designs where less steel can be used. That's what he mentioned. But he has forgotten the cement industry also, to some extent, is also emitting carbon dioxide. That is one. And second thing is that why should not we factor in the life cycle cost of steel? Because it can be remanufactured, recycled, reused. That should be the concept, using more steel than cement. Because life cycle cost is very important, which we should factor in that. These are my 2 questions, and the perception should change with this.
Fair questions. Would you want to respond to that?
Yes. So both parts of the question are very interesting. So currently we are focusing on decarbonizing concrete in a major way. In fact, we have started to redesign our mixes by using higher GGBS content uh, concrete, as well as we are geared up to do our first pilot for LC2, LC3 concrete. Uh, with that, I think we will be able to bring down the overall uh, concrete-related carbon emissions, which are actually close to 50% of embodied carbon, by say close to 25 to 30% in next 2 to 3 years. So we are very aggressively focusing uh, on concrete decarbonization through the methods which are already out there. Uh, the cement that also goes in the block work, so there also we are trying to find alternatives which are say zero carbon in that case. So there the focus is very high because that's the biggest emission source. When it comes to uh, higher, you know, usage of steel, the issue is that if I go for a steel structure composite building, the cost is probably 1.4 to 1.5 times than a typical concrete building. Now, when the focus is primarily on mass scale housing uh, and affordable housing, that option is not so much open because that premium cannot is not affordable. Uh, in an ideal world, I think concrete and steel will definitely compete, and the simple fact that steel is perpetually recyclable. When the zero carbon steel horizon is near, maybe at that time, and when that is commercially viable, maybe at that time the steel may win that competition.
I'm sure that it's not far away. It's not far away. It will definitely come. Maybe 5-4 years, it will come. But definitely you have to see the life cycle cost, which you are also agreeing that you will be looking to that. So that's very important that we should really think of using more steel. And I think in the European countries or maybe in the globally, you should see outside, they are using composite buildings where more steel is used. And secondly, let's not forget, the execution time in steel construction is much less than the concrete.
Sure. Ankit has a quick response to that.
So I'll just quickly respond to the cost, and that's exactly the elephant in the room. So three points there, and I've been saying that throughout my answers, that when we talk about a premium, it needs to be pragmatic. It can't be 100% premium. It needs to be realistic, commercially viable. That's the first point. The second point, market mechanisms are going to play a role there. So let's say CBAM mechanisms, which are supposed to come next year in Europe, those kind of mechanisms will ensure that people work in the right direction. People will start spending, investing in this technology, and there'll be a commercial business case that could be made for that. And the third point, very specific to Mahindra, we also follow something called a carbon price, which is at around $10 per ton of carbon. This is currently used primarily for scope 1 and 2 emissions, and the budget from that is used to undertake projects to reduce scope 1 and 2 emission. But in the future, this can be thought of as a lever for scope 3 emissions as well. And companies will have to make both voluntary and involuntary regulation-driven commitments to address that. So again, pragmatism is very important, but it's possible to sort of make a realistic business case around this. And all different industries will have to come together. Steel for one, but also let's say the power supplier, renewable power supplier in the cost of power, and hydrogen, green hydrogen, the cost of hydrogen. So it's a collaborative effort which will make the business case possible for this.
Sure. There's a question on the left. The first
Atul, if I could also just come in and comment on that, because it's exactly how I was going to also raise the point in contribution to Anik. We look at actually the terminology around brown premium. So here we talk about green premium, but also if you flip that around and look to the CBAM mechanism or the internal carbon pricing that we're seeing increasing companies look to so that they can commercially make decisions viable for now, but also the future. This term around brown premium, I think, is maybe an interesting one to possibly explore further.
Thanks, Shane.
No, thank you. Arjun Mehta from Fortescue Future Industries. We are a green hydrogen developer and a clean energy developer hoping to enter India. Ankit, you've, I think, answered my question in your previous talk, so I'll keep it brief anyway. I'm a green hydrogen developer, so my question is relating to that. Even more so, for Ron and Ankit as such, for your segments. Could you tell me what kind of green premium would warrant the use of green hydrogen, let's say in the steel sector, to move from gas-based DRI to green hydrogen-based DRI? And for products such as Mahindra Electric, Mahindra Automotive, for instance, or Mahindra Life Spaces, for Lodha Group in the real estate segment, in the slightly more premium segment, do you see beyond CBAM for exporting stuff, beyond a typical business case where we know there is a premium for green hydrogen in the immediate term? When do you see uptake in slightly more premium products such as electric vehicles, such as more expensive luxury housing, for instance, where customers would drive their need for having a more sustainable home or a more sustainable car, and therefore that trickles down into your business plan as well? At what stage do you see, and what are the policy levers, commercial levers, which will sort of warrant green hydrogen to support that business case of yours?
I think I can answer that, but as I very rightly pointed out in my previous question, we don't directly procure green hydrogen in any of our businesses. It's something that would be procured by, let's say, the steel industry. For us, the end price that we get is going to be important, and there, as I said, $10 per ton of carbon is an indicative direction in which we can think about it. But at the same time, this is a conversation that would be driven by market factors. So, for instance, as the shift from the ICE vehicles happens to the EV vehicles, the pace at which that grows, the kind of customer demand that you see, and the kind of premium customers are willing to pay for that, is going to eventually drive that decision. Currently, the focus in the EV segment when it comes to cost is entirely focused on batteries, because that's the bulk of the cost and that's the area. But as battery prices come down, you'll have more flex to bring in green products in other sectors. So to give you also a very tangible example, let's say for all the vehicles that actually get exported to Europe, we currently focus on something called the ability to recycle that vehicle. How much of the vehicle can be recycled? That is currently at around 96 or 97%. So 97% of a vehicle can be completely recycled for vehicles exported to Europe. So I think as the industry and the customer demand progresses, we'll sort of invest into that. But that's honestly what I can say today.
So, hello, my name is Parth Kumar. I'm from Center for Science and Environment. My question was to Ankit and Mr. Sreekanth, basically regarding CBAM. Because CBAM has now come in, and probably if your companies are exporting some products, right? And and they have been defining the definition for green steel or how much carbon they exactly want in Europe in their products. But in India, the process is still going on, and most probably they won't match completely seeing the conditions of Indian steel production, which is very different from how steel is being produced in Europe. So how is this a challenge for you for your export-oriented products? Will it hinder you from buying steel from Indian players then? Because probably green steel definition in India might be not at all matching with the green steel definition in Europe or what they're asking. So how is it affecting your export strategy, and what are you looking forward to? Because this is quite a probable thing that might happen.
So I can give a very short answer. CBAM is currently not applicable to the auto sector. So there's no immediate consequence. In the long term, as more sectors get covered, it could be there. And as I said, at the end of the day, the CBAM mechanisms focus on the core sectors. So the hard to abate sectors, or now what I like to call possible to abate sectors, it's ultimately those sectors that will have to move, because at the end of the day, we are committing to buying. But the actual action has to happen in the hard to abate sectors only then. And CBAM largely is going to focus on the hard to abate sectors only.
Yeah, I think I have no other response.
Yeah, I mean, but this will grow. But yeah, I agree. Auto is not there, but I think this is just the beginning, and this will happen, and I think there has to be some strategy for that.
We has to really come out with the rules and regulations. I think USA has it exempted by CBAM because they have a mechanism.
Yeah.
So I think similar things should happen here also.
Sure. I think it will take time also for India.
Why should it take time?
I think we saw a write-up a couple of days back on CBAM and the government's initiatives also coming in. So it should not be taking a long time, as he said, but it will have an impact, and we are trying to discuss also with the European team of ours and how we can, because we are into a lot of exports, as you rightly put it. So, but then we don't have a right answer at the moment. We're also discussing internally and what can be done. So.
Thank you for your inputs.
I saw a hand.
Hydrogen maker. What will be the cost of the hydrogen which will be supplied? That is important. How well people will use that. I think there was a question from the hydrogen over here. So what will be the cost of the hydrogen? That is important.
Siv, did you have a question?
Yeah,
I saw a hand up. Yeah.
just a follow-up on the last question, maybe the SKF person can answer that. If I'm a auto component or an automobile manufacturer, what's it that very basically I should do in expectation of the CBAM? Because yeah, it's some time, but I should be prepared, right? What's the minimum thing that I should do today?
I think I may have not full answer for the question, but I think getting certified as a responsible steel or getting aligned to the science-based target initiatives, that could be the easiest step for you to be part of CBAM. This is what I can tell you, but I'm not sure about it yet, so from my side.
Getting prepared is the essence of it.
Yeah.
Okay, one final question from Mr. Mukesh, and then we close it out.
It is not a question, just this thing, what Mr. Abdullah has told. I think that is having some merit. What he's saying is that high strength steels to be utilized. Because if you see the example of Japan, in Japan, all steel structures, 80% of the infrastructure is built by steel only. Only 20% is used by concrete. Whereas in our country, it is reverse. And there, if you see, even the capex also is at least 20 to 25% cheaper than concrete. Whereas what Mr. Abdullah is saying, it is 40 to 50% higher than the concrete. So that's why they are going with the L1 basis. But if we can bring the focus, every company is bringing focus on making high strength steel. Our limitation is only 250, 350, like that only. But in Japan, they have gone up to 790. So the weight of the steel is reduced by more than 50%, 60%. So what Mr. Abdullah is saying, I think this may be one of the pathways for controlling the emissions also, so that emission intensity is reduced. So that is my suggestion.
Fair point. Great. Thank you so much. I think we are at the end of the session. With that, I would just like to thank all the speakers, Ankit, Sreekanth, Jen and On for being on the panel and sharing all your perspectives. This has been a wonderful conversation. I'm sure the crowd will and the audience will agree as well. So can we just applaud all the comments that we've received? Thanks so much, everyone.